listening to Rootbound, a podcast about plants for when you're stuck inside.
I could really go for some pancakes right now. Luckily, this episode of Rootbound is sponsored by maple trees. And remember, it's not a pancake without maple syrup.
Hi everyone, thank you for listening to this episode of Rootbound. I am the host of the podcast. My name is Steve, and Rootbound is the podcast about plants for when you're stuck inside. And each week, I invite a guest who joins me on the show to share with us all about a plant that means something to them. And then I share with a guest about a plant that means something to me. And through this process, we can all learn more about plants and learn more about each other. It is the philosophy of this podcast that everybody has at least one plant that is meaningful to them, because plants are so integral to our lives as humans on this planet. Now, before we meet our guest today, I want to give a plant definition that the guest and I kind of struggled to come up with later in the show, so you'll hear that. And so just think back to this part of the show and fill in the blanks, because we talk a little bit around this idea. And that is the definition of indeterminate inflorescence, and then the opposite, which is determinate inflorescence. And so these are two different ways that plants can create flowers. And let's first talk about what determinate inflorescence is, and then we'll talk about indeterminate, which is the word we are trying to figure out later in the show. Determinate inflorescence, from my understanding, is when the first flower of a plant appears at the very top of the stalk, and then the other flowers, if there are any other flowers, appear below that. And so it's kind of at the terminal point of the plant, so therefore it is determinate, and that means that there's going to be no more flowers above that flower. And in some cases, that means that that will be the only flower. I think about sunflower as a good example of a determinate flowering plant. It's got that one big flower at the top. If that flower is gone, there will not be another flower. Sometimes in some flowers, you'll get some smaller ones below the big one, but the big sunflower is the determinate inflorescence, and it's at the top of the stalk, and it's the one that appears first. Indeterminate is the opposite. These are flowers that appear at the bottom first, and then they kind of work their way up. And if the plant keeps growing, there can be more and more flowers, depending. So it can actually keep producing flowers as long as the plant can keep growing, or is stopped, by some kind of external force. An example of an example of a indeterminate inflorescence that I can think of is, if you think of lavender, think about the little flower head of lavender. The flowers open from the bottom first, and they keep working their way up. And if that stalk gets longer, there can be more and more flowers until it decides it's done. But they start from the bottom and work their way up. There's a bunch of different kinds of inflorescences that are both determinate and indeterminate, but that's kind of the general gist of the idea. And the plant that I'm going to talk about later is indeterminate. So just remember that when we're chatting through how the flowers on it grow. And so now it's time to meet our guest.
Life science?
Indeterminate.
Hi, Will. Thank you for joining me on this episode of Rootbound.
Hi, Steve. Thanks for having me.
You're very welcome. Do you have a plant to share with us today?
Yes, I do. My plant is the beautiful Ginkgo biloba.
I am so excited to hear about this plant because, well, there's a lot of reasons. There's one really amazing fact I learned about it that I think you're probably going to get to, and if not, I'll bring it in, that I learned recently. But I think there's a lot about this plant that I didn't really know. Anyway, let's get into it. First of all, why did you choose Ginkgo biloba, and why is it meaningful to you?
Ginkgo is one of the first plants that drew my attention and actually kind of enthralled me and brought me into the world of plants. I was originally trained in more biomedical research. And there was one summer where I was spending a lot of time in Central Park, and this tree really caught my eye because, as many of the listeners will know, the leaves have this really unique fan shape. So morphologically, it looks super distinct from other trees. And then I learned, upon doing research on this tree, that it has really amazing biochemistry, has really amazing evolution. It's actually a really, really old tree. It predates the evolution of flowers by about 50 million years. And
Whoa.
many people go as far as calling it a living fossil, which is a frown that is a term that scientifically some people frown upon a little bit, but basically means this tree is 200 million years old and has remained morphologically really similar to the earliest evidence found in the fossil record. It's a really, really
Wow.
old tree, has cool chemistry, and just looks really unique to me.
Interesting. I'm trying to think about it now because, like, I know there's a few in my like neighborhood, and in the fall when the leaves all fall, it's really clear like what's happening. But I've never really thought about the flower part. So is it a gymnosperm or is it something
That's right.
else? It's a gymnosperm.
It's a gymnosperm.
Interesting. Because I normally think of gymnosperms as being like needly,
Yeah,
but that's
needly
probably
and cone bearing.
yeah. But this one's kind of not cone. I mean, it does have cones technically, I guess.
So it makes these kind of like fruit-like cones. They're thought to be really reduced cones.
Hmm.
They're much smaller than like a pine cone, for example, and they also have this like really foul characteristic smell. I don't know
Yeah,
if you've ever smelled
I
like
have for sure. Yeah,
a ginkgo nut. It smells kind of
yeah.
like dog puke. Like it's really pretty bad. And for that reason, actually, many cities will choose to plant just male ginkgos instead of the female kind of fruit bearing. Of course,
Ah.
these are not actual fruits, right? Because they're not flowering plants. But yeah, that's right. Ginkgo is a gymnosperm. It's actually part of a family that's the only family in its order and the only order in its class and the only class in its division, Ginkgo phyta. So it's part of
Whoa.
this huge kind of like division of plants that used to cover the earth, and now Ginkgo biloba is the only remaining survivor and member of this division.
Whoa, that is phenomenal. I think I had it in my head one time of like, well, what are the other ginkgos? Because we always hear ginkgo biloba, but then like that's the genus, but there are no other.
There are
Wow.
no other. That's the only one that's still as extant today. Yeah.
That is fascinating. Okay, so let's get a little bit more into your like connection with it. Like, when you saw it there, like what? Yeah, what about it? What like grabbed you about this plant?
So New York City, which is where I developed my interest in plants, kind of counterintuitively because it's so like
Sure.
urban. I was spending a lot of time in Central Park, and there's some really beautiful ginkgos there. They're really once they reach like 60, 70 years, they have this like really statuesque shape. They have like really kind of like tall crowns. And this is in contrast to many of the ginkgos that I see now on the West Coast, which are much younger and tend
Mm.
to be these kind of unassuming trees. Like you wouldn't really look twice at a young ginkgo. They don't
Hmm.
look particularly nice. But the ones in the East Coast really grabbed my attention. And then in the fall, you mentioned they turn this like really beautiful yellow, like this like
Hmm.
deep, really, it's like one of the most striking kind of like flashy yellows that I see in the fall. And then they do this cool thing too, where all the leaves drop within a day. So you'll see like
Yeah.
one leaf fall, and then you come back the next day, and the tree is essentially bare. Um, but so yeah, I guess the tree initially attracted me superficially just because of the way that it looked. And then this was during a time when I was sort of going through a change in my scientific interests. I mentioned I was trained in biomedicine and biomedical research, and I developed my interest in plants kind of alongside discovering the ginkgo. And I remember kind of coming upon signs of the ginkgo tree in various areas of my life. So like there was this university in Tokyo, Tokyo University, that I was
Hmm.
considering just visiting as kind of like potentially a post-bac researcher, and their logo is a ginkgo leaf.
Oh, cool.
Um, and then I would just run into it in like some books I was reading, like The Overstory by Richard Powers, which I'm sure you're
I'm familiar.
familiar.
I haven't read it yet. It's on my list for sure. Yeah.
Amazing book, and one of the kind of big symbols in this book is the maiden hair. It's the ginkgo. That's another
Hmm.
name for ginkgo. So it was kind of coming up in various areas of my life, and I kind of took it as a sign that like, oh, I should investigate this interest in plants. And now here I am. It's been a few years, and I studied plants for my PhD. So the ginkgo started it all.
Really fascinating. Okay. Well, I'm gonna have more questions here, but let's get into the fun facts and dazzling details of plants. You've already mentioned some, but I think there's a lot more. It's like you said, it's kind of unassuming, but yeah. I mean, I didn't even know it was so unique as you saying being like the only plant left of this entire lineage. But yeah, what about it? And maybe why has it been successful for so long? Like, why did it stick around and the other ones failed?
Yeah, so it's a really, really tough tree. It's pretty slow growing, but so before flowering plants existed, I guess the ecology of, the Jurassic, which is when the first fossil evidence of ginkgo is found,
Wow.
was really different. And so you had these like different niches where ginkgo apparently thrived really well in these like disturbed kind of like stream side environments, which is also a bit counterintuitive because slow growing plants tend to not do super well in disturbed sites. Like you think of highly disturbed sites as being really conducive to like herbaceous habits, like these
Hmm.
like fast growing plants. And before flowering plants emerged, ginkgo somehow had like scratched a niche in this environment. And I'm not sure why it did particularly well, but it used to cover basically like the now continent of Asia, and much of Europe. So it covered a
Wow.
large swath of the world and had many kind of like different representative species. And then flash forward to basically the last glacial maxima, which is like 15,000 years ago. So really not that long ago. Ginkgo had all but disappeared, basically. There was like
Wow.
a few sites in kind of like the mountains in central China where the tree is still found in this kind of semi-wild state. Although even there, it's assumed that Chinese monks actually played a huge role in preserving the tree. So I'm
Mm.
not sure what um, gave it its success during the Cenozoic, but it's pretty clear that once flowering plants emerged, they really kind of took over and erased many of these slower growing gymnosperms, and ginkgo was one of the victims of the flowering plant as it just couldn't keep up with flowering
Mm.
plants, which have much faster growth, much higher photosynthetic rates. They have much higher rates of evolution because they tend to have shorter lifespans. So once flowering plants arrived, I mean, everything changed, and now you look around and 95% of what you see are flowering plants, even though they're a really recent innovation in the plant world. Um, but
Fascinating.
ginkgo survived nonetheless somehow.
Very interesting. And so, do you think that it survived? Because I guess it does have, speaking to your background in like the biochemistry, it does have a lot of this. Like you hear about ginkgo in regards to like traditional medicine and things like that. Did it stick around because we wanted it to stick around?
Perhaps this Chinese monk hypothesis is just a hypothesis. I don't
Hmm.
think there's much concrete evidence, and I guess the reasoning behind this hypothesis is that the ginkgos that survive today are strikingly genetically homogeneous.
Hmm.
And it's true you mentioned that there's many uses in folk medicine and traditional medicine of ginkgo. It's thought to have kind of neuroprotectant, antioxidant properties, owing to its really unique biochemistry. And that makes sense. It's kind of like even within the gymnosperms, it's in its own clade, in its own lineage. So it evolved chemistry that's unique to this
Hmm.
clade. So it makes a lot of these like compounds, like secondary metabolites, like you hear like ginkgolides or bilobalides, which are just kind of like derivatives of the name ginkgo biloba, which are under investigation for kind of like anti-hypertension medicine,
Hmm.
potentially with regards to like memory troubles. And I think the evidence coming out of those studies is mixed. Like it's not like, oh, it's not a wonder drug, but
Sure.
it shows some amount of protection. And it's true that the tree is really naturally tough. Like it doesn't really have any pathogens that effectively
Oh.
attack it. It even survived, actually. It's one of the few species that survived like within the 2 kilometer radius of the Hiroshima blast in Japan in
Whoa.
1945. Um, Less than a year later, that tree was putting out leaves after the blast, whereas like many of the other trees around had died. So it's
Wow.
a very tough tree. Yeah.
Yeah.
Um,
Wow. That's a dazzling detail, man. I'm gonna look
yeah.
up pictures of that. That's amazing.
Yeah, absolutely. There's like 150 of those trees that grew kind of like in a row, and they've become a symbol in Hiroshima in Japan of the resilience of the city.
Yeah, incredible. Let's maybe talk a little bit about the Leafs because they are so unique. And what do we know about that and maybe why they are the way they are or anything about the Leafs?
Yeah, the fan shape is interesting. You don't see that shape a lot in the plant world, and I'm not sure what the advantage there was, but one other thing that's fun about the leaves is that if you if you've ever felt a ginkgo leaf, they feel tougher and more waxy than many other leaves, especially like angiosperm leaves tend to be
Hmm.
more delicate. And that waxy feeling is actually like basically a really thick cuticle. So the cuticle is the outermost layer of the plant leaf, and it's thought to have kind of like um, a role in minimizing water loss, basically through
Mm.
stomata. So having a thick cuticle makes you more resistant to water loss, meaning ginkgo was probably really efficient at keeping its water inwards. And it also means that when the leaf falls on the ground, it doesn't decompose for months. Like you can still find these yellow ginkgo leaves like months after they fall into the ground. Um,
That
and
reminds me
it's
of my experience with ginkgo. There's just one little part that I used to walk to the metro all the time, and there's ginkgo trees, and like you said, they all fall at once, which is really beautiful when it happens, right? Because it just turns the whole ground yellow, but also very slippery. I've
yeah.
several times, and for quite a while when they're all there on the ground for a long time, not breaking down. Yeah, it's can be a little hazardous.
Are you speaking from experience?
Yes, yes. That part will have to be. I have not fallen, but I've like nearly fallen slipping on ginkgo leaves before.
Yeah. Yeah, they make this like big yellow carpet and the leaves will just stay there for weeks to months. And having that really tough cuticle is, I guess, indicative of a really different environment, right? Like that means
Mm.
that the environment in which those leaves evolved required them to be tougher, which is fun to think about. You can kind of like think about, oh, maybe this world just was a little bit less forgiving back then. Maybe this
Mm.
is like an anti-herbivory mechanism, to prevent
Mm.
like dinosaurs from basically chewing on these leaves. And
Wow.
and interestingly, dinosaurs were actually thought to be kind of the major seed disperser for ginkgo, which is why they smell terrible. They smell like vomit to attract large animals and dinosaurs to spread the seeds.
Wow. Every time I smell that smell now, I'm gonna be like, this is just what dinosaurs like.
This is dinner. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. Wow, that's really fascinating. Okay. You might have this on your list still, but I just want to make sure we get to this. The thing that I learned recently about ginkgo, and you're probably gonna be able to fill this in. I learned it when I was learning about fern reproduction, and they share something. Can you fill us in about that?
Yeah. Yeah. So they don't make flowers, and they have the characteristic of making these really large swimming sperm, which is unusual for
Mind blowing.
plants.
Yeah,
Yeah.
when I learned that
You
about
can
ferns, I was like, wait, what? Yeah,
You can
but
almost see them with the naked eye. They're like a tenth of a
whoa.
millimeter, which is like almost you can basically see little, particles in like a drop of water if there's ginkgo
Wow.
pollen around. Um, and these sperm are interesting. They have like thousands of flagella, and like all other plant sperm, the flagella are positioned at the front of the sperm. So you think of like a human sperm and it has a little
Yeah,
tail in the
yeah.
back, but a plant sperm actually has like little swimmers at the front.
Like pulling
And
it.
yeah, basically it's
Like
like,
swimming through like yeah, wow.
yeah.
Wow.
Uh, and yeah, ginkgo has unique reproduction. It's unlike that of most other gymnosperms, even in that in the time between pollination and fertilization, there's actually many, many months. So, you think of
Mm.
like a flower reproduction, and you get like a pollen grain that falls in the carpel, and then within hours, you have kind of like the sperm fertilizing the ovule. In the case of ginkgo, it takes months to years because the
Whoa.
growth of the pollen tube is extremely slow. So even once the pollen has landed where it needs to, it actually needs, up to a year in order to fertilize the ovule. And that's when you eventually get that stinky fruit at the end. And I keep saying fruit, but I should say
Mm.
it's not a real fruit, closer to a
Mhm.
cone.
It doesn't have it does it, so the ferns have this really interesting process where there's like this secondary form of like being, which is I forget the word for it, where like it's the fern that we see, but then there's like these miniature tiny little ferns that are like the
The
like an
gamidified.
alternating, yeah, right, alternating
Yeah.
generations, right? Does
Yeah.
ginkgo do that too, or is it a different process? Okay.
No. So yeah, you're referring to, yeah, the alternation of generation, which is in some basal plants like, mosses and ferns, you have distinct gametophyte and sporophyte phases, which is
Hmm.
basically a haploid and a diploid phase. And both of those are free living. But once you get to seed plants, which
Hmm.
ginkgo
Hmm.
is one of
Hmm.
them, You don't see that anymore. So the gametophyte phase is completely internally contained within the ovule, within the seed. And so it's not a free living plant. Only the
Hmm.
sporophyte is a free living plant.
So how does this like swimming sperm part work? Like, yeah, well, how do they meet each other? So I think about, insect pollination or wind pollination, but this seems to be very water based. And how does that happen?
Yeah. So the female part of the plant, the female reproductive structure of the ginkgo, makes a little drop right at the top called a pollination drop, which is full of like sugars and minerals. And what happens is you have, pollen in the wind, ginkgo
Hmm.
pollen, and some of these pollen grains will actually land on that tiny drop. And the drop
Whoa,
eventually recedes inwards into the gametophyte, into the ovule. And that's where those ginkgo are able to swim. So there's kind of like this aqueous environment inside of the female reproductive
interesting.
structure. Yeah.
Whoa, that is incredible. And I guess just thinking this through, it seems like the angiosperms figured out that kind of motion can happen on its own in other ways. Like you don't necessarily need like this active movement because of capillary
Hmm.
action or other kinds of stuff like that. So it's like maybe a little inefficient of the ginkgo, but
Yes.
interesting.
Yeah,
Wow.
whenever you see these kind of like water-based reproductive mechanisms, like mosses are another example where
Mm-hmm.
they need to be essentially wet and covered in
Mm.
this like aqueous film in order for the sperm to swim to where they need to go. Whenever you see those mechanisms that use water in reproduction, they're typically reminiscent or indicative of older plants,
Mm-hmm.
plants that evolved back when the relationship to water was still really critical for reproduction, and we tend to think of those as earlier diverging plants.
Fascinating. Wow, that's really really interesting. Do you have any other fun facts or dazzling details about ginkgo that we have missed?
Let's see, let me look at my notes. I think I've covered most of them. Um, oh, there's a fun other kind of like plant sex fact about the ginkgo is that it can change sex throughout its
Oh
life.
wow. Oh
So
wow.
even when cities, nowadays you can find ginkgos anywhere because they're commonly planted as ornamentals in cities.
Hmm.
Normally you mainly see males, but the ginkgo has a way of kind of making sure its population is roughly 1-to-1 male to female. So it'll
Wow.
commonly actually switch its sex, and most commonly from male to female. And sometimes what it likes to do is on a male tree, it'll just make one female branch or one female shoot, so that it has the
Whoa.
capacity of self-pollinating if it needs to.
Classic. And I guess the city planners who were like, oh crap, I didn't think about that part.
Yeah, and now you end up with, these stinky cones in your city.
Yeah, that's a classic, I think, story of like yeah, it reminds me of the story of the Bradford pear of like, trying to design this pear that was like not self-fertile and then they didn't realize that you just have something slightly different pear near it and
Yeah.
then now it's everywhere. Um, that's really fascinating. Wow, that's cool. I'm gonna have to look up that as well. So wrap it up for us about the ginkgo biloba. Like, yeah, tell us a little bit more about like where it brought you where you are, or anything else about kind of your personal connection to it.
Yeah. So what I really like about the ginkgo is really its like deep evolutionary history. I think I like thinking in deep time. I've been trying to think more in this frame of, like eras and eons, because it provides a nice contrast to the really fast pace of life nowadays. And being in a PhD program is really fun, but it's a lot of back to back and a lot of pressure to be producing research and new knowledge. And I really like this contrast with the slow growth and the deep history of the ginkgo tree. I think it provides a context that's really in tune with, you know, earth processes, which happen slowly over time. And it makes you think, like with this really fast pace that we live in, like what are we losing? And what's the danger there of thinking only in this really narrow frame of reference? So yeah, I love Ginkgo for that reason. It really explodes that frame of reference, and suddenly you're thinking in millions of years rather than in days or hours. So I think about ginkgo a lot. It's unfortunately not the plants that I will get to study for my PhD, and that's because studying trees on a molecular level is really, really difficult, and my
Hmm.
work is very subcellular. I basically don't get to touch a lot of green things. I'm mainly just pipetting microliters of clear liquids. To understand how, plant proteins respond to water is basically my work. So I like having ginkgo in the back of my head, reminding me that that's how I found my way to plants.
Ginkgo biloba. Dieses Baumsblatt, der von Osten meinem Garten anvertraut, gibt geheimen Sinn zu kosten, wie's den Wissenden erbaut. Ist es ein lebendig Wesen, das sich in sich selbst getrennt? Sind es zwei, die sich erlesen, dass man sie als eines kennt? Solche Fragen zu erwidern, fand ich wohl den rechten Sinn. Fühlst du nicht an meinen Liedern, dass ich eins und doppelt bin?
Thank you so much for sharing about ginkgo biloba with me. Do you mind if I share a plant with you?
Please go ahead.
I'll start off by saying at first glance, this is maybe not as exciting, and then maybe it's not. I mean, ginkgo is like it is a singular plant, I guess I've learned, right? And I'm just going to talk about another weed that grows in my yard, which I do every now and then in the show. But when you start going into any plant, you start learning really cool and interesting things about it. So, and there's some stuff here that I'm not sure about. And there's even some like I didn't actually know your background in like the biochemistry stuff. So there's maybe some chemicals here you might even know more about that I've learned about. So feel free to jump in with anything you know about this plant or anything that I say.
Mm-hmm.
And I even have like one question that I was trying to think through that you might know the answer to. So the plant I'm going to choose, it's in my yard right now, and it is most commonly known as Annual Fleabane. You familiar with any Fleabanes?
I'm not.
Fleabanes, they're asters. Another name for this one is Daisy Fleabane because the flowers look very daisy-like. And there's a number of it's a very widespread genus. The Erigeron genus is Erigeron annuus is what this one is called. I think the type species is Erigeron acris, which is a European one. But this one is really cool because even though some people think of it as a weed, it is a native North American plant, and I always love hearing about native North American plants that can like compete in the like invasiveness stuff, and it is really good at that. It's able to colonize disturbed areas. That's why it shows up in lawns a lot, and it's one of the many plants in my yard that I leave that I'm sure like my neighbors hate, but I love just letting it do its thing because it's a native plant and it's great.
Mm-hmm. I'm looking at it right now. It kind of looks like a little daisy. I've definitely seen those around.
Yeah, they're super common. You'll see them on the side of roads all the time. And there are a number of other fleabanes, and like I actually can't be 100% sure that this is Annual Fleabane because there's a number of other native ones to North America, but this is the most common. I think I'm pretty sure the one in my yard is this, but there's a number of other ones that look pretty similar, and like you have to be like someone who I'm not really good at all the language for like describing the really like intricate details of how the morphology of plants and stuff, but I'm pretty sure this is the one. One thing that's really kind of, I think, interesting about it is it's one of those plants that we rarely hear about that is invasive the other direction. We always hear about Asian plants being invasive in North America, but this is actually an American plant that has become invasive in parts of Asia and Europe, which is I don't know. I always wondered if we only hear about it the other direction because that's where we are, and if it's as equally common the other way, or if there's something about the way things move that it is more common here and not there. It's an interesting question, but this is one that has gone the other way.
Yeah, that's an interesting point. I don't know actually the answer to that question. I don't see why it should be more common westward for invasives to kind of become a problem.
The one theory I've heard, I think I was talking to someone on the show about this, I forget who now, is that the Eurasian continent is bigger and has this kind of more lateralness to it. So you probably had more mixing of plants in general, and then it probably made them a bit more resilient to that. But when you started getting the plants in this side, it was just kind of a different way of plant spreading, and so maybe the plants weren't quite as prepared for plants that
Yeah.
had that kind of long, um,
Yeah.
yeah. But who
Uh,
knows? I would love. I don't know if there's been. I should look up if there's probably someone who studied this. But I would really love to know like how common it is the other way. Of course, you get into definitions of what is invasive too, and that gets pretty
mhm.
complicated as well.
Yeah.
Particularly with like a genus. I mean, particularly a genus like Fleabane, because there's lots of them, and I think it's sometimes hard to tell what's what depending on where you are. Um, so one really fascinating thing that I read, there's a website that is called Himalayan Wild Food Plants, and apparently, at least according to this and a few other sources, uh, Annual Fleabane has become like a wild plant in the Himalayas. Even though the pictures I saw of it look a little bit different, and there's some native Himalayan fleabanes as well, and so I don't know if it looks different just because it's changed its morphology a bit to adapt to the climate, or if it is a different plant and there's some mixing of names. That also gets confusing with some of these like plants. Like,
Yeah.
wait, which one are we really talking about? But apparently, it is edible from what I understand, and the most common way it's used in Himalayan cultures is to make saag with it, which is essentially boiled greens that are then fried in mustard oil or ghee, depending. So you boil them, then you add a bunch of spices and you like fry it. And you've probably had some kind of saag at Indian places,
Hmm.
but you
Yeah.
can make it with this and other wild greens. I gotta try that. That actually seems like I don't know why I'm not making greens more often that way. It sounds like a great way to do it.
Yeah. Start eating some flowers.
Totally. Yeah. I mean, I went through, I haven't done it in a while, but I went through a real phase of eating a lot of the weeds in my yard. But I should pick that up again. I think it's a little bit too late for the fleabane here in the like depth of summer. You got to do
Yeah.
it when they're a little bit like younger, tender leaves.
Yeah.
Some people also make a tea for it, and it does apparently in many traditions have lots of traditional medicinal use, similar to ginkgo. Probably not quite as like prominent of a plant, but it does have a lot of uses. And this is also where it's like a little bit tricky because it definitely has like uses, traditional uses in Native American cultures, but it's also mentioned in traditional Chinese medicine, and that's one where it's like the references are they referring really to annual fleabane here, and that is like transferred over because there are some plants that did that, or is it talking about fleabanes in general? I'm not sure, but it's one of those plants where you list what they say it does, basically name something and somebody has used it for that at some point. So
Yeah.
I try not to get too much into like the specific medicinal uses. And also always a warning to anybody if you're going to eat something, make sure you know what it is and
Hmm.
don't take advice from a podcast about what you eat. Um, let's go back to the name a little bit. So first, the scientific name Erigeron annuus. Annuus just means annual, clear. Origeron apparently is comes from the Greek, and the era means early, and the geron is like gerontological. It's like means old, and so it
Hmm.
apparently means early old man because it's a it blossoms relatively early in the summer, but then it does have the same kind of seeds like a dandelion, like a pappus style stuff. So it looks like little beards, I guess, when it seeds out. Even though I need to pay attention to that, I've only really become like the cool thing about this podcast is when I start thinking about plant more in detail, I tend to pay attention to more. Like in the past, it's just been kind
Yeah.
of a weed. So, um,
Absolutely.
and then the name fleabane comes from its traditional belief that it can be used to repel fleas, and I guess there's not a ton of like scientific evidence about that, but like in Europe, I think where the name fleabane comes from, that was I guess something it was used for, maybe, and I've read like maybe using the smoke or maybe just like putting the plant around, but
Huh.
I haven't found a lot of evidence of like that's really how it can be used, but that's where the name comes from, fleabane.
Interesting.
Yeah. So the question I have for you, I was trying to figure out the word for this because the thing I noticed just today when I was looking at it is we've had a little really dry spell here. It's been super hot and super dry, and all the flowers had just dried up. But I went to go look at it now, and we had a really good rain yesterday, and there's little new flowers that are starting to open up. And what is that? I was trying to like, what is that property of a plant that is able to like keep flowering even like some plants they flower and then they're done, but this is like continuing to flower even if it's gone over like a series of drought and things like that. And I thought that was pretty cool.
Hmm. Yeah, that's interesting. I'm not sure what the word is for
Yeah,
that specifically. There's like those resurrection plants that can basically completely desiccate and then come back to life. But this
This
sounds
is
a
not
little
quite
different.
that. Yeah, it's still like green, and it's just like it's been flowering. Apparently, one thing that's really great about this plant and why I want to keep it in my yard is it's really great for pollinators because it flowers for a very long time, right? Starting
Hmm.
in June and apparently all the way in the fall. But even after it's like experienced this extreme heat event where it can't flower anymore, once it has the resources, it's able to start again. Which I think we have a lot of chicory in the neighborhood as well, and chicory does that. You'll see like it just keeps flowering over and over again. It's very very fascinating.
Are you noticing that it's flowering after like a rainfall event?
Yeah, I did notice that. I mean, we had some good rain the last couple of days, and I just went out there now and I saw a few like little flower heads. They hadn't unfurled yet, but they're like clearly like new. And then it was right next to it on the same like multi head are like dried up flowers that didn't last. So
Yeah, that's pretty cool. That means the plant is storing aside these little buds that it's keeping kind of for later use when it feels like it has the right environment to flower. And many plants do this vegetatively. Like you'll see at the base of a redwood, for example, after a fire, you get these little like saplings basically that come out of
mm.
the trunk. But it's interesting that this is happening just at the flower level, that it's keeping these little flower buds uh, kind of stored away until they're ready to come out.
Yeah, that's a good point. I didn't think about it that way because yeah, I guess it has to have those buds like there already. It's not like it's kind of the ability to like create them at will,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah, it's storing away some stem cells for later use, basically.
Fascinating. Yeah, I want to look more into that and think about other plants that do that because yeah, I noticed at first with chicory, which there's a place where I walk by all the time, and you'd think it's dead, and then all of a sudden it has more flowers, and they like, and those I think only last. I think chicory flowers may only last a day, or maybe I'm wrong about that. But anyway, I think this one has more long-lived flowers. But of course, it just was too dry and hot
Mhm.
for the flowers to stick around. But it's still going, which is pretty fascinating.
Yeah,
I
it's a
only
good adaptation to have if you're gonna try to survive in droughted environments. It's the ability to kind of time your flowering so that it occurs after rainfall.
And that's why I guess it's also a really good as a quote unquote invasive or weed because
Yeah,
the weather events can't stop it, which is pretty cool. Um,
yeah.
I did find a cool article which is called "Phytochemistry and Biological Activity of Erigeron annuus," and I'll put a link to that in the show notes. But basically, kind of a review of its traditional ethnobotany uses, but also just of all the the bioactive compounds in it, and like so many, but so many plants are like that. I think we like, I that's one of the most mind blowing things to me about plants. Is just like how many of those secondary metabolites exist, and they're like these little
Hmm.
like chemical factories that produce such cool molecules for investigation. Are you doing some stuff related to that, or?
I don't do much phytochemistry,
Mm,
but there's a lot of cool work happening in that area. I mean, 50% of our medicine comes from plants. So I think people have realized that, that's just a fraction of what we know is out there. And each plant, each species has its own kind of reservoir of unique chemicals that are found nowhere else in the world. So yeah, definitely a lot under investigation. And I agree. I mean, I think it's so cool that plants are such masterful organic chemists. And to this
mhm.
day, they make compounds that have these like really weird structures, and our organic chemists are organic, or like human organic chemists are not capable of making them in a lab. So your only solution is kind of like observing the plant and learning how it does it, and potentially just like harvesting the chemical directly from the plants.
Super fascinating. Yeah, we've talked a bunch on this show about natural product chemistry. My wife is a chemist, so I've got like a little bit of that, and she's actually an organic chemist. She hasn't done much. She was more of like a yeah, she not as sort of like a natural product chemist, but it is fascinating to think about like that, like knowing a little bit of like all the steps involved in like synthesizing a complicated organic molecule, and that plants
Hmm.
are just like doing this all the time for sometimes not even clear reasons. Like, I mean, they have a
Yeah.
reason, but like why they have certain molecules and what mix of molecules they have is really fascinating. So in this
Yeah.
paper cites that, and I think this is probably not an uncommon number, but that Erigeron annuus has over 170 identified bioactive compounds, which is
Hmm.
which is like pretty amazing.
Amazing.
The one that stood out to me, and this is one where I don't know if you have anything to say about this one. The one that stood out to me that it had, just because the name stuck out to me, is caffeic acid, and I've now learned that that's like almost all plants have that to some degree. But it is
Hmm.
in coffee, I guess, as well, which I guess is where somebody decided to name it. But yeah,
No, I've never heard about that. Do you know
Yeah,
what its function is?
it's an antioxidant. So apparently, there's been a lot of research into using it for different medicinal purposes. And I guess I have one source that says, oh, actually, this I'll read this quote from an article from NIH. It says caffeic acid is a polyphenol classified as an HCA and secondary metabolite in the lignin biosynthesis, which occurs in almost all plants, specifically in coffee, thyme, sage, and olive plants, and it is the main component in the distinctive scent of coffee.
Interesting.
Yeah, but apparently this plant has it too. But yeah, when that stood out to me, I was like, oh, it has caffeic acid. That's interesting. But yeah, apparently it's actually almost all plants have some degree of
Hmm.
caffeic acid because they're producing lignin. Uh,
Yeah.
so that was pretty interesting. But there's lots of other stuff in like I'll put a link to the show notes. I think I think a common theme of this podcast is learning about a plant and then learning that science always needs more investigation to learn more about it. I feel like we don't spend as enough time on like figuring out what's going on with all the chemicals in these plants, and it can be like quite hard to pull apart.
I mean, yeah, the diversity is just mind-boggling. You would need, that's exciting to me. There's just like there's so much unknown. But yeah, you would need years and years and years and many, many devoted scientists to uncover all of that magical stuff that we don't even know about yet.
Yeah, super fascinating. But before we go, I just want to know a little bit more of what you could talk about what the research you're doing and what you're kind of interested in your plant studies. That but let's get beyond the clear liquids and understand a little bit
Yes,
of what's going
yeah.
on there.
Yeah, absolutely. So I'm interested in the relationship between plants and their environment.
Yeah.
I really like the interface of kind of living systems and then the environment in which they live. And one of the kind of, big, and this is no surprise, one of the big constraints for life on Earth is water. All life on Earth is water-based, and water we think of as an abundant resource, right? We live on a planet that's covered 70% by ocean, but fresh water is a really rare resource. And so it's actually a very limiting resource for life on Earth. And plants specifically have evolved to be able to sense water around them. This is kind of an intuitive thing. We think of roots as like growing towards water, but concretely, how does a plant root know where water is? And how does the
Mm.
presence of water direct the evolution of roots? So one commonly observed phenomenon is that when you have like kind of a primary root, so just like a downward pointing axis, um, that primary axis will grow many more lateral roots on the side that has water and
Mm.
way fewer on the side that has less water. So there's interesting questions there as to, well, what part of water is actually being sensed, right? Because we could say, oh, it's sensing wetness, but what does wetness actually mean? And then how does the detection of water actually translate into development, into growth of those lateral roots? So that's broadly what I'm studying. I'm at the
Fascinating.
very
We don't know the
beginning.
answer to that.
No, we don't.
Wow, that's like such a basic thing about plants, I guess. But that's not. But
Yeah,
you thinking it through, I'm like, yeah, like how does a plant sense water, right? Like, that's
yeah.
amazing.
If you want to get to a mechanistic understanding, as in like which specific proteins, which structures within the
Hmm.
cell are responsible for this, yeah, we don't have the answer to that yet. And the implications obviously run deep, right? Like we are living in a world where fresh water is becoming increasingly scarce and where the demand for agricultural production is increasing. So there's a big kind of impetus there to understand how plants sense water so we can help them sense water better and maybe
Hmm.
fare better in conditions of droughts. Um, so yeah, I'm using a
That's super
combination
interesting.
of kind of molecular biology and then electron microscopy
Mm.
to understand how these things are happening on the kind of like subcellular scale.
That's really interesting. It makes me think about, how I feel like some plants are so efficient with water, even though some of those processes of photosynthesis, in some ways, like have to like be inefficient with water, right? Like the whole transpiration process.
Yeah.
When you think about it, I mean, it's not inefficient because they do it and it makes sense, but yeah, it's interesting to think about that, about how plants think about water, because it's very different from what we do.
Yeah, absolutely. And water is intimately tied to growth in plants because each cell is like, our cells are full of water as well, but in plants, cells elongate and grow with turgor pressure. They grow only when water flows inside of them. And a plant body is held together. Like when you see it, the plant in my background here is held up by turgor pressure. Our bodies are held up by bones and tendons. But water really has this unique kind of developmental role in plants. So it makes plants a really good system for understanding how life interacts with water. And there's many, many basic questions there that haven't been answered. So I'm at the very beginning of the journey because I'm a second year where I'm in the process of coming up with these questions and then trying to find ways that they can be solved within a reasonable time frame because I'm also not trying to spend 10 years here.
Excellent. Well, we'll keep an eye out for some publications and maybe talk to them on the show. Maybe have you back on if you have a big publication and hopefully shorter than later. I know how PhDs go. So.
Yeah. Yeah, I'd love that. Thanks so much.
So a bit earlier, after Will was done speaking about Ginkgo biloba, you heard a little bit of German poetry, and that poem is a poem called Ginkgo biloba, and is by Johann Wolfgang von Goethe. And you've probably heard of Goethe before. He was a really famous German writer. In fact, Wikipedia says he is widely regarded as the greatest, most influential writer in the German language. Wikipedia also says that his occupation is poet, novelist, playwright, natural philosopher, and statesman, which that's quite the resume. One thing I didn't realize about Goethe is that natural philosopher part. He was also like a scientist and a science writer, and he wrote a book called The Metamorphosis of Plants, which apparently, also according to Wikipedia, is that in this book, Goethe essentially discovered the serial homologous nature of leaf organs in plants, from cotyledons to photosynthetic leaves to the petals of a flower. So homology is that idea of like similarity among plants, and we talk about in the show, like many plants have very similar parts, even though the plants can look very different. Another good example of homology within mammals, for example, if you look at a bat wing, it has the same kind of structure as like a human hand, right? There's a homology within mammals. Goethe apparently essentially discovered the homology within plants in this book that he published. So he wasn't only a great writer, he was a scientist, but this poem, Ginkgo biloba, was not in that book. It was actually kind of a love poem, a complicated love poem. I'm not going to do too much poetry analysis here, but it's a very interesting poem. And if you look up, and I'll put a link in the show notes, he actually handwrote this poem on a piece of paper, and below it he taped 2 ginkgo leaves. And it's quite a beautiful page, and I'll let you go to the show notes and read about the history of the poem. But just to close out the show, I thought I would read an English translation of the poem for those of you who don't speak German. And I know it's nice to enjoy just the sound of the German speaking, but it is also nice to know what is being said. So I found one of those translations that also tries to keep the rhyming scheme. So it's not exactly the direct translation of the German. And if you want to do that, you can also look it up in the show notes. But let's close out the show with a reading of the English version of Ginkgo biloba by Johann Wolfgang von Goethe. In my garden's care and favor, from the east this tree's leaf shows secret scents for us to savor, and uplifts the one who knows. Is it but one being single, which as same itself divides? Are there 2 which choose to mingle, so that each as one now hides? As the answer to such question I have found a sense that's true. Is it not my song's suggestion that I am one and also 2? My guest on this episode of Rootbound was Will Dwyer. Will is a PhD student in biology, and he works on plants. He is at PhytoWill on Instagram, and I'll put a link to his website in the show notes. If you like Rootbound and you want to help support the show, visit rootboundpodcast.com/support to find all the ways you can support the show, including just telling a friend about it. Rootbound is hosted by the indeterminate Steve Ellington. On this episode of the show, we heard a reading of the poem Ginkgo biloba by Goethe, read by Hans-Jürg Grosse, music by Christian Griegesgota, fake ads by David Lonnie. Rootbound is a podcast about plants for when you're stuck inside, but if you can go outside, track down a ginkgo and imagine what it was like when it was just a snack for a dinosaur.
Maple trees! They make waffles possible!